Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third conference day of Ars Electronica.
English, but nevertheless, I remind everybody, German-speaking, English-speaking, we have wonderful, perfect interpreters, so please make sure you have your headphones if you need them. Wir haben den dritten Tag in den
So, this is the third day of our conference. Another highlight. The question origin, how it all begins. We started by focusing on Create the World, a festival with and for children and young people. On Friday, we discussed science, CERN, string theory, and today we are talking about the Internet. Can the Internet be one of those spaces where the framework conditions for something new exist, ensuring that ideas are also implemented and have an impact? Now, this is a very burning issue at the moment. Can we use social media to attack things, to topple things? And can we also use them to find the necessary ideas and answers which we need in order to think the new social and political paradigms that we need in a globalized society? We have two people who are pretty well known at Ars Electronica, Isaac Mao and David Sasaki, organized a wonderful conference here at Linz 2 years ago. They developed the topic for this session. They selected the speakers, they organized and prepared the program, and they will moderate the session. So without any further ado, I'll hand over.
This very interesting day. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Gerfried. Thank you. Unfortunately, I didn't bring my translation headset with me, which is my excuse for not offering a connection between string theory and Facebook, but we might get there later in the day. I am David Sasaki, and along with the Chinese blog father, Isaac Mao, I'm the co-curator of today's public symposium, the Public Square Squared. It's been a pretty insane year. We're trying to make sense of what's been a year of connectedness, chaos, communication, miscommunication in some cases, and even revolution. When Ars Electronica first began, over 30 years ago, the speaker's podium looked very different than today. The fashion was also a little bit different. But at the time, Ars Electronica was one of the only annual events that was really dedicated to analyzing what is the impact of technology on society and creativity. Today, on the other hand, there are multiple events looking at all aspects of technology's effect on various parts of our lives, not just every single year or week, but actually every single day. There's an entire conference class of people that do very little except for go from one conference to another conference to explain technology's role in business, marketing, communication, politics, journalism. I was able to find a conference also about social media and pet care. So we really examine the role of technology in all aspects of our life constantly. And I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is why? Why do we keep coming to these events when already so much information about the internet is written on the internet? And much of what we're going to be saying today is not revolutionary new. We're trying to come up with explanations that have been tackled by a lot of different people on the internet. I think that there are two reasons we keep coming to these events. One, by our very nature as humans, we obsessively seek new information, and we obsessively seek to make sense of new information. And two, we sense that history is accelerating, the pace of history is accelerating, and it's pretty exciting to be part of it and to help write its first draft. So 3 years before that first Ars Electronica, with the podium and all of the different speakers, a 35-year-old Richard Dawkins published the book The Selfish Gene. And in Richard Dawkins' view of the universe, we humans were actually just mere vehicles, mere vessels that allowed genes, genetic information, to replicate itself. And usually we helped genes along in this process, mostly because we like sex so much. But in the same book, Richard Dawkins also coined a new term, which was a meme, a word that had never been used before until this book came. And a meme, according to Dawkins, is a unit of human cultural evolution. So now humans, not only are we just mere vessels for genetic information to replicate itself, but we're actually vessels for all sorts of information to replicate itself. And we compulsively share it with others. And those memes, they're competing with one another for one very scarce resource, which is our own attention. Today, in many parts of the world, we have new terms like information obesity, information anxiety, information overloadedness, information addiction. And in the same way that pollen awaits a honeybee, information is waiting for our information addiction. It's waiting for us to check Twitter. It's waiting for us to check our Facebook account. It's waiting for us to compulsively pull out our cell phones and our computers and check our email every 2 or 3 minutes or 2 seconds. I think about 100 years ago, this was called word of mouth. Today, we do it constantly, every time we're pecking into the little keyboards of our machines. Some information, it turns out, is more mimetic than other types of information. We saw a couple years ago that it's nearly impossible to watch a video of Tom Cruise speaking about the Church of Scientology and not to share it with our networks of friends. We are compelled to do so. This year in the Middle East and North Africa and other parts of the world also, it seems like terms such as freedom, democracy, and free speech are also popular memes. But it's also important to recognize that anti-Islam and anti-immigrant messages have become more mimetic here in Europe. It's often stated that we now create more information every single year, I think it's now every single 8 months, than was created from the very first cave painting known to humanity until 2002. But the question for us is, why is some of this information so much more successful at seeking replication than other types of information? Why does some type of information compel us to share it with our social networks immediately? Other information makes us fall asleep or we just ignore it. In the 1950s, information found a new way to replicate itself, the television. And over the next 10 years, it would have 2 profound effects on our society, 2 paradoxical effects. It would create a sense of social alienation and also of global solidarity. In 1967, 1 year before an outbreak of protests across the globe, Guy Debord published The Society of the Spectacle, which argued that television and slick marketing was engendering a consumer culture in which everything that was once directly lived, in Debord's words, was now just mere representation. At the same time, Mexican intellectual Octavio Paz argued that life was beginning to imitate television more than television was actually imitating life. Some of us are starting to see the same effect happening with Facebook. Broadcast television was definitely responsible, in part, for this phenomenon of the mere representation of all that was once directly lived. But it was also the medium used by young protesters the very next year around the world to attract attention to their protest movements, because it turned out that protest was also mimetic. These photos from the Paris protests of 1968 spread across the world like wildfire. Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who's now a politician in Germany, was one of the organizers of the infamous 1968 Paris protest, said of his counterparts in other countries, he said, "We met through television. We were the first television generation." Abby Hoffman, who's always very photogenic, said, "A modern revolutionary group headed for the television, not for the factory." And in fact, Abby Hoffman was one of the organizers of the protests at the Chicago National Democratic Convention protest in 1968. And when the police started attacking the protesters violently, the protesters started chanting, "The whole world is watching. The whole world is watching." And it was the first time that the whole world actually was watching, the first time it was possible for the whole world to be watching. That same year, they invented the video cassette for news recorders so that you actually had the same-day newscast. In 1967 and beforehand, usually what you saw in the day's news was what happened yesterday, not in the same day. But it's important for us to recognize that in hindsight, the protest movements of 1968 were mostly failures. The Franco regime continued in Spain. Brazil's military dictatorship continued despite protests. The students the Mexican students never achieved any of their goals, and justice was never brought to those who were responsible for their massacre in the autumn of 1968, right before the Olympics. In August, the Soviet tanks rolled into Prague and remained until 1989. The temporary weak alliance between the labor movement and the youth movements of Paris in 1968 broke apart by the end of the year. The Vietnam War continued, apartheid continued in South Africa, and Charles de Gaulle remained in power in France despite the very best efforts of Parisian protesters. So in 1968, with the help of television, information was more successful than ever in its history at replicating itself, at spreading around the world. But it wasn't able to change policies, and it wasn't able to end wars. The very next year came the invention of the internet, the best thing that's happened to information and its ability to replicate itself since the written language. So now, while in the West we talk about information obesity and information overload, in some other countries, the internet permitted information to replicate itself around censors for the first time. In countries like Tunisia and Egypt, which we'll be talking much more about today, governments long censored radio and television, and information was now having its heyday. It was eager to show humans acts of government corruption, acts of police brutality. Major social media-fueled protests have occurred this year, and this is phenomenal to really think about, have occurred in Portugal, Tunisia, Spain, Senegal, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Uganda, Algeria, Oman, Greece, Jordan, Morocco, Mexico, Chile, Wisconsin, state of the United States, Malaysia, and in the small island nation of Mauritius, over 15,000 people have signed on to a Facebook page committing to take to the streets tomorrow, we'll have to see if they get their 15,000, to demand for greater civil rights. So only now are we really beginning to witness and make sense of how the internet is changing us as a society and how we are changing the internet. It's hard to make any certain declarations, but what I can say with some certainty is that I think that future historians are going to see that what television was for 1968, the internet has become for all of these protests in 2011. Now, the question for us is, will today's youth be more successful than the youth of 1968 in creating lasting social and political change? Many writers have observed that the protests of 1968 were anti-power protests. They were protesting against the system. They were protesting against the reality that they saw around them, but they weren't offering any real alternative. They weren't saying, we're protesting for this. It turns out that we humans like to protest against much more than we protest for. Today's protests in 2011 are also anti-power protests. They've started out that way. They protested against Mubarak. They protested against Ben Ali. They protested against some of the financial systems taking place in Southern Europe right now. But not many of the protests have yet offered alternatives. Today's speakers will tell us where those protests have landed and whether real alternatives are taking shape. So information seeks to replicate and spread itself further, and we, as information-hungry humans, are happy to oblige it. But it's also increasingly important that we seek truth and compromise through discussion and debate. I hope that today we will all engage in discussion. I encourage you all to participate in today's discussions. You can also participate through Twitter using the hashtag #Square2, the number 2. And hopefully we will help understand where all of this movement is happening, where a new global society is leading us. Before introducing this morning's speakers, I want to briefly talk about the format of the day and how Isaac and I envisioned some of this discussion. This morning's session will examine mature revolutionary movements that have either succeeded, maybe in quotation marks, or are very mature and far along in their movements. Part of that is to see what happens after the revolution. Can you also think of ways to use these same tools to build new models of governance, new models of society? Then at 12:30, we're going to have a 90-minute lunch break. At 2, we will all return back here, and we're going to have an hour-long panel with the winners of this year's Pre-Ars Digital Communities category, which was established in 2004 to recognize some of the creativity that is necessary in order to create communities that act as the base of the movements that we've seen. Some of you who were here 2 years ago will remember that Julian Assange from WikiLeaks was one of the speakers in the Digital Communities category panel, and he was trying to convince us that WikiLeaks was going to have this revolutionary effect on the world. And we said, okay, Julian, that sounds good. Who would have thought, what happened? In the afternoon at 3 o'clock, we're going to then join with the afternoon speakers who are going to talk about some countries that have resisted major social movements so far, despite the best efforts of some really dedicated activists. And we're going to try to see, why is that the case? What explains why revolution takes place in one country but not in another? But we start this morning with three incredible speakers, three incredible women. Lina Ben Meni is a Tunisian free speech activist who was one of the voices of this year's revolution in Tunisia. She teaches at the University of Tunis and is the author of the recently published book, A Tunisian Girl, which is also the title of her very popular blog, which I've been following for a long time with the help of Google Translate. Zeynep Tufekci is an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. She also maintains another very popular blog, which I recommend very much, technosociology.org. And Leila Nachawati is a Spanish-Syrian activist, with ancestry in two countries that have been overwhelmed by protests this year. She is a social media consultant and a board member of the Spanish Association of Social Media Managers and contributes to many websites, including Global Voices, Periodismo Humano, and Al Jazeera, along with many others.